This is the Amtrak Aramark safety training. Next slide. Learning objectives. At the completion of this module, participants will be able to demonstrate knowledge of various pieces of Amtrak equipment, demonstrate knowledge of Amtrak safety practices and applicable rules, demonstrate knowledge of hazards associated with working within rail operation areas, demonstrate knowledge of hazards associated with working near energized overhead catenary systems. Next slide. Modules. Module 1, Amtrak equipment. Module 2, railroad terminology. Module 3, on or about track, train, and self-propelled equipment. Module 4, vehicle safety. Module 5, blue flag basics. Module 6, AMT2 basics. Next slide. Amtrak equipment. Amtrak utilizes various styles and types of motive power, including diesel locomotives, electric motors, and dual mode equipment. Next slide. Amtrak equipment. Expect train movement on any track from any direction at any time. Next slide. A train is defined as an engine or more than one engine coupled with or without cars displaying a marker. Next slide. Tracks. Tracks consist of 2 steel rails, wooden and concrete ties, and ballast. Next slide. Fouling a track. Fouling a track is when you're close enough to a track to be struck by equipment on that track within 4 feet of a rail or in between rails referred to as in the gauge. Next slide. Switches. Switches enable trains to move from track to track. Switches are utilized to route trains away from work locations to provide protection for workers. Next slide. Basic rail yard safety. While walking, look ahead, remain clear of tripping and falling hazards, and if necessary to look to the side or rear, stop walking and use caution on slippery and uneven surfaces. Next slide. Leave equipment, tools, materials, scrap, or other items clear of pathways and platforms. Do not leave tools or items where they will fall or be knocked down. Next slide. Step clear of rails, derails, pipes, and other items in the path. Next slide. When on duty, walk, do not run. Keep to the right. Give way to persons with loads. Keep hands out of pockets. Use available handrails. Use every stair step. And use only designated routes. Next slide. When on or about standing or moving equipment, do not walk, stand, or sit on rails or track structures. Do not lean against standing equipment unless proper safeguards are provided. Use caution during bad weather and when visibility is impaired. Next slide. Look both ways for an approaching train, self-propelled vehicle, equipment, or machinery when stepping from standing equipment, getting on or off equipment, and driving, pushing, or pulling a cart or trailer. Next slide. If necessary to work on equipment located on the track, keep sufficient lookout in both directions to see approaching train or on-track equipment. If the train or equipment approaches, stay clear until the train or equipment is passed. Maintain sufficient lookout to be sure that no other train or equipment is approaching on any track. When a train or equipment approaches, move clear of all tracks. Expect train movement on any track at any time from any direction. Next slide. On or about tracks and trains. Keep as far as practical from passing equipment. When crossing a track, keep at least 10 feet from stopped equipment. Next slide. Vehicle safety. Before driving any vehicle, perform walk-around to ensure vehicle is safe to move and free of defects. Inspect the tires, inspect the mirrors, and inspect for damaged or missing parts. If the equipment's defective, do not use it. Tag it defective and alert your supervisor. Next slide. Only trained and authorized employees may operate vehicles. Do not ride passengers on are in vehicles not designed for passenger occupancy, must be seated on approved seat, do not project body parts beyond sides or rear vehicle, and do not get on or off moving equipment. Next slide. Utility vehicles must obey all operating rules such as speed, inspection, reckless or careless operation is prohibited, maintain control at all times, be prepared to stop within one-half their range of vision short of any person or object. Next slide. Utility vehicle drivers must obey all operating rules such as avoid striking, standing, or moving equipment or being struck by moving equipment. Maintain sufficient clearance to tracks and equipment on those tracks. Operate only in designated areas and over designated crossings, pathways, and roadways. When provided seatbelts, they must be worn, and do not make adjustments or disable any speed limiting device. Next slide. Maintain good housekeeping of vehicles and equipment. Do not store loose items on the dashboards or rear windows, such as clipboards, tools, or helmets. Next slide. Before backing up a vehicle, make sure it is safe to move. Look in the direction of the movement. If vision is impaired, utilize a second person when available to guide and protect movement. If the person protecting the movement disappears from view, the driver must stop immediately. Next slide. When operating self-propelled equipment, trailer, or vehicle, test the brakes and warning devices immediately after starting. Maintain constant lookout in the direction of motion. That includes rounding of corners, passing doorways, congested areas, crossings, and intersections for obstructions and other unsafe conditions. Do not permit interference or distraction of driver. Reduce speed and give warning if person is close to equipment, and warn employees thereon before suddenly applying brakes. Next slide. When uncoupling or coupling tractors, trucks, tugs, and trailers, keep hands clear of the ring, the handle, the catch, or other pinch points. Next slide. Blue signal. Clearly distinguishable blue flag, blue light, or blue tag by day, or a blue light or blue tag by night, signifies that the mechanical department workers are on, under, or between equipment. Next slide. Knowledge check. Which of the following describes fouling a track? Choose all that apply. A. Close enough to a track to be struck by equipment on that track. B. Within 6 feet of the rail. C. Within 4 feet of the rail. The answers are A. Close enough to a track to be struck by equipment on that track, and C. Within 4 feet of the rail. Next slide. Trains should be expected from any direction at any time on any track. A. True. B. False. The answer is A. True. Next slide. When crossing a track, keep at least how many feet from standing equipment? A. 15. B. 5. C. 10. D. 20. The answer is C. 10. Next slide. When walking through rail yards, which of the following should you step clear of? Choose all that apply. A. Ballast. B. Rails. C. Ties. D. Derails. The answer is B. Rails and D. Derails. Next slide. What should be inspected prior to driving any vehicle? Choose all that apply. A. Mirrors. B. Tires. C. Coupling between tug and cart or trailer. The answer is A. Mirrors, B. Tires, and C. Coupling between tug and cart or trailer. Next slide. What should be done if you need to back up a vehicle but your vision is impaired? A. Blow the horn twice, then proceed to back up. B. Utilize a second person. C. You are prohibited from backing up any equipment. The answer is B. Utilize a second person. Next slide. Which of the following does a displayed blue signal signify? A. The train is about to depart. B. The train is not scheduled to move. C. The mechanical department employees are on, under, or between the equipment. The answer is C. Mechanical department employees are on, under, or between the equipment. Next slide. Questions? Next slide. AMT2 electrical operations for employees working at locations on the NEC. Next slide. AMT2 electrical operating instructions. Instructions issued for the protection of Amtrak employees, property, operation of trains and locomotives in electrified territory. Next slide. Catenary system. Amtrak AC electrified territory extends from Washington, D.C. to Boston and from Philadelphia to Harrisburg. It consists of a system of wires suspended between poles and bridges supporting overhead contact wires. New York to Washington is 12,000 volts. New Haven to Boston is 25,000 volts. Next slide. How must all overhead wires be considered? Energized or live. That means dangerous to life. Minimum approach distance is 15 feet, and it must be maintained between the employee and exposed energized lines or equipment while working. Next slide. Energized or live wires are dangerous to life. Next slide. Third rail. Third rail power is currently used only in New York and Sunnyside Yard. It's 750 volts DC. It's always considered energized, and it has a 6-inch minimum approach distance. Next slide. Dangling objects. Do not touch or attempt to move. Protect others and equipment from coming in contact, and maintain a distance of at least 15 feet from objects dangling. Next slide. Knowledge check. Next slide. How must all overhead wires be considered? A. Energized, live, and dangerous to life. B. De-energized and dangerous to life. The answer is A. Energized, live, dangerous to life. Next slide. What is the minimum approach distance for the third rail? A. 15 feet. B. 12 inches. C. 6 inches. The answer is C. 6 inches. Next slide. Third rail is always considered energized and live at all times. True or false? The answer is A. True. Next slide. What is the minimum approach distance from an object dangling from the catenary? A. 5 feet. B. 25 feet. C. 15 feet. The answer is C. 15 feet. Next slide. Is it okay to step on the third rail protection board if you need to cross the tracks? A. True. B. False. The answer is B. False. Next slide. What is the minimum approach distance from the overhead catenary wires? A. 15 feet. B. 12 feet. C. 25 feet. The answer is A. 15 feet. Next slide. That concludes the Amtrak Aramark safety training. Thank you.